Certainly has been some moderation in the latest Purchasing Manager Index for Indonesia. The rate of expansion is the slowest in the past 5 months, although I have to emphasize that it is still showing expansion. So the pace of expansion has moderated, and that's due to a slowdown in new orders and also in output, very much due to weakness in external demand. So it's export orders that have led the downturn in orders. I think domestic demand in Indonesia is still quite resilient, but export orders have been weakening because we're seeing some slowdown in the US, in Europe, but also in mainland China because of the COVID restrictions. China is a very important global market. And so the weakness in China is also a reason why Indonesian exports have been affected by weak external demand conditions.
So you agree that the pace of manufacturing in Indonesia is quite slowing down, but export in Indonesia is still resilient despite so many economic turmoils. But actually and specifically, what kind of business sector or manufacturing sector that experiencing the most pressure? Are only labor-intensive business line or also the capital-intensive ones that are also affected?
I think when we look at the overall picture of Indonesian exports, it should be emphasized that commodity exports are still strong. So if you look at coal or LNG, these exports are still very strong and are helping Indonesian overall exports, which have done very well this year. And if we look at, the first 9 months of the year, Indonesian exports have been growing very strongly. But when we concentrate on what is happening in manufacturing, then we do see increasing weakness, particularly in labor-intensive industries, kind of low-cost manufacturing, such as footwear and textiles. And these have been hit because of weaker demand in the US, in the EU, and also in China. Of course, in China, the weakness of demand is due to COVID restrictions, which resulted in a number of lockdowns in cities in China throughout this year, and that's still continuing. But the situation in the US and the European Union is being affected by high inflation and tightening monetary policy. And because of high energy prices and high food prices, all of these things are hurting consumer spending power. And that is what we're seeing, is that demand for footwear and textiles in particular have been hurt in Indonesia's manufacturing sector. And that has resulted in job losses. So there have been steady increasing job losses in some of these labor-intensive sectors. However, there is also some good news that exports of some of capital-intensive areas, such as nickel, is improving because of the Indonesian government policy shift since 2020 to stop exporting nickel ore and to export processed nickel. So that is a strategic move that has helped exports of some more capital-intensive goods.
Right. So, Rajiv, you mentioned particularly and specifically on the labor-intensive sectors, because at the present there are so many layoffs, which is occurring around thousands of Indonesians worker in the Indonesian manufacturing industry, especially the labor-intensive sectors, textile, and so on. Can this efficiency trend still occur in the future amid the current Indonesian and also the global economic trends that is deteriorating?
I think the key problem is that demand is weakening in the US and Europe. We do forecast that next year in 2023, that there will be a mild recession in the US and also in the European Union and also in UK. So this is one of the key reasons why we're seeing this slowdown in demand. Consumers in these Western economies are suffering because their spending power has been hit by higher oil prices. They don't have, spending power on other goods because they're paying so much more for fuel, for heating costs in the winter months. And so all of this has hurt their ability to buy other products such as essential consumer goods. And that's why we're seeing footwear and textiles are being hurt. And I think these headwinds will continue in at least the first half of 2023. But I don't think it's going to be very severe downturn. So we do expect that exports will slow down in the next few months from Asian countries to Europe and the US. But we're not expecting a severe recession in the US and Europe. So there will be weakness, but it's not going to be very, very devastating. So I think the outlook is certainly negative, but not for a deep downturn.
Right. So you are optimistic that it is not going to be very severe, but still in the domestic economic pressure in Indonesia. Has the level of inflation in Indonesia are the main contributor that is significantly pushing the domestic economic pressure inside the nation?
I think the situation in Indonesia has been much better than what we've seen in Europe or the US, because Indonesian inflation pressures have been more moderate compared to what we're seeing in the US this year, or even compared to Europe. So I think although Bank Indonesia did have to tighten monetary policy this year, the amount of tightening has been relatively moderate compared to the tightening that we've seen in the US, for example, because inflation pressures in Indonesia have actually started to ease. In September, inflation had reached 6%. It's eased to 5.7% in October. And now, of course, world oil prices have come down during November quite a lot. So that gives some hope that inflation pressures might ease a little bit more. So I think certainly inflation has been a problem, and we have seen tightening monetary policy, but the tightening has been relatively moderate in Indonesia. So the impact on households in interest rate sensitive areas will be less. So in other words, the domestic demand should be quite resilient this year and also next year in Indonesia. In October, retail sales in Indonesia were up 4.5%. But in the first 10 months of the year, auto sales in Indonesia are up 25%. So that just shows you that domestic demand is actually doing quite well in Indonesia so far this year.